What do I look for in a knife? Well, that's been a question a lot of you guys have asked, so there's a lot of different things that I look for, and they're gonna be determinate on a lot of different things. So we're gonna go ahead and look at the intro, and we're gonna start talking about it. So the list of what I look for in a knife can be consolidated down into like 6 things, and it goes from size to geometry, blade shape, handle shape and material, lock mechanism, then weight and blade material. And that's the order in which I look at them. So let's go ahead and we'll crack into these individually. So first of which is going to be size. So the first thing we're going to talk about is size. And I'm not saying that like I have a size limit. I wouldn't say that I want this knife to be bigger, this knife to be smaller. But what I'm talking about is, does the size and proportions of the knife feel correct for that knife? Some knives, you would want a larger knife. This is something that you would be able to use. This would be a knife that you could do a lot of heavy cutting and cut up a lot of cardboard. This is a knife that I would probably carry more in a self-defense role. As long as the size and dimensions of the knife are not too far off from what I want, and as long as it doesn't feel awkward in hand, I'm good with the size pretty much on knives. This knife is pretty well balanced. It's going to feel good in hand. It's going to do the things I want, and if I want to have a little bit more knife that I can get some more work done, this does a good job of it. This is something that is nice and long and slender in a self-defense role. This is going to work really well. It's really ergonomic. So depending on the point of use for the knife, the size is going to be something that I'm okay with regardless of the type of knife. Would I want this knife to be smaller? I don't think so. I think that the dimensions on this knife would feel different if it was smaller. There are some knives that I love the full-size version, and I get the mini, and I don't like it. So what I'm talking about size is it just the size is not something that they've done. They didn't make the knife really big to just get someone's attention for that. The size for that handle and everything is married up really, really well. This knife is great. I don't think I would want this knife any larger. I don't think I would want this knife any smaller. So it just happens to come up to what your preference is and what the point is. Some knives can get too big and be too much and you get too far away from your work surface. Like it just doesn't feel balanced, and it just feels like you don't have much control when it gets a little longer. I've mentioned that about some knives, that this knife would have been better off smaller. So not that there's, like I said, not like there's a criteria for size, but does the size match the balance and the feel of the knife overall for good, reliable use? So there you go. Size is the first one. The next one is going to be edge geometry. So depending on the knife, like this knife is a fixed blade. It's fairly thick behind the edge, but it still has decent edge geometry. But this knife is more of a self-defense tool. You want something a little bit more robust. This is my Stonefish design. This was designed to be like a combat utility. This has kind of an in-between in the middle, but you want that to be robust on a fixed blade. A little bit more meat behind the edge. Because in the field, when you're doing a lot of hard work, you don't want this to up and crack or chip. So the geometry on these is going to be different than something like this. This is a very thin pocket knife. The edge geometry on this is very good for slicing and fine detail work. Super thin behind the edge. As a matter of fact, this Ferrum Forge Aluris is one of the thinnest knives behind the edge that I've had come in a long time. So different knives. This knife is a much more hard use knife. It has got a lot more meat behind the material, a lot more material behind the edge, I should say. And it's got a thicker behind the edge profile, but this is also something that you could use in a lot harder situation you could here. If you were, say, cutting on something and happen to pry, much less chance you're going to damage that edge. And then you have some different ones where you have a lot of weird geometry back here where it's really thick and things like that. And we'll talk about this in a different part where we talk about blade shape. But depending on what you're going to do with the knife, what your blade geometry, edge geometry is going to be. The geometry is what actually does the cutting. It's a very important part of any knife. The thinner this is behind, the better the geometry is, how far it comes down and how thin it gets behind the edge is going to dictate how well it goes through material. This knife is very thin. This knife would cut, even though it was dull, this knife would cut some materials pretty well. There's videos out there, as a matter of fact, Super Steel Steve did a video of an unsharpened kitchen knife that he's making where he had it ground thin, the behind the edge geometry was good enough. He was cutting onions and cutting paper without an edge on it. That's one of the main things. So depending on what you're going to do with the knife, your geometry is going to be dictated by how hard to use and those scenarios. So there is no one real answer, but I do know these days, not being out in the field and not doing a lot of camping, prefer a little bit thinner behind the edge geometry. It's going to allow that to cut, and it's also going to allow you to touch the edge up easier. Nowhere near as much material to remove. You're going to have a lot longer life on that before you start having to reprofile in sharpening and things like that. So there you go. Geometry. It is a huge factor in knives, and it is determinant on what you're going to do with the knife, what kind of edge geometry you want. So let's move on to the next one. Blade shape is our next criteria. So there's a lot of different blade shapes out there. This is a recurve Tonto. This is a recurve, this karambit. You have pretty straightforward drop point knives. Now this one has a unique blade grind. And then you have things like Wharncliffe, sheep's foot. But there's a lot of different kinds out there. There's clip point, drop point. So when I look at blade shape, what I'm looking for is what am I going to do with that knife? This is self-defense. This knife is predominantly self-defense. I would not really use this knife for day-to-day use because the blade shape is so unusual. But you could, if you needed to, use this to cut. You could whittle down wood with this. It would work. A lot of guys like recurves because you maximize your cutting surface here. And I do have to admit, a Tonto that's done really well has that secondary point, and that acts as another point to cut. This cuts incredibly well because it forces material up into that and then to cross there. And then you have this larger forward area that is a little bit thicker and more robust, and you can use it like a scraper or a chisel. This is like having two knives in one. This is more of a Wharncliffe sheep's foot style blade where you've got a big long flat and you can do a lot of cutting, and what you don't have happen is, in the case of this, where you're cutting material and then you lose your cutting potential as this slips off the end. It's like cutting straight all the way across. So these come in really handy for a lot of tasks. You can get sheep's foot that are completely straight, Wharncliffes that have a little bit of curve. They are great for a lot of tasks, and they are one of my favorite blade shapes. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to bump that. Sorry about that, did not mean to bump everything. But what I was saying is these, you maintain that cutting potential all the way across. These are also a little bit less sharp. It's a little bit easier with these to not necessarily puncture through something. They're not as piercing. These are things that are really good for detail work and cutting where you don't necessarily need a piercing tip. This is not going to be something you stab into material really well, but they are robust and they cut really well. But all these knives, it just depends on what you're going to do with the knife. Blade shape is going to be determined by use. If you're a hunter, you're going to want something more along the lines of like this, maybe a drop point or a clip point where you have a little bit of belly so that you can use it for multi-purpose. Sometimes you'll want something that's very swept for skinning animals and things like that. But like I said, blade shape is something that you're going to have to look at case by case basis. What are you going to do with the knife? Depending on what I'm going to do for today determines what knife I'm going to grab out of my collection. So there you go, blade shape. Next criteria is going to be handle shape and materials. Handle shape can make or break a knife. All the knives that are here are extremely ergonomic knives. This is my Sebenza. This is the Ray Laconico Sirius by Artisan Cutlery. We've seen this one, the Valona, the Mastiff by Artisan, and the Ferrum Forge Design Gent. Handle shape is incredibly important. If the handle is not shaped right, it's not going to be comfortable. If you have big hands, you may shy away from some smaller knives. There may be elements of a knife that are uncomfortable. You want to try and find a knife that fits your hand well and is shaped the way you want. I don't like a knife that is, typically I don't like knives that start fat and get skinny. This one is kind of an exception. I feel as though they feel a little bit unstable, like your hands are going to come out. I like handles that are more like this, where you start a little skinny and then it brings out and it kind of widens out or stays neutral the whole way through. It feels more secure in your hand. It does not feel like it's going to come out. Here's another example of that. You have that swell up area and then it swings up into your hand and it just feels very secure, as well as this. So handle shape is important. And then the next criteria is material, handle material. Now that is something that a lot of times winds up being more a show of flash and pop. This is carbon fiber and titanium. This is a G10 that I had hydrographic by my buddy Nico so that it had a pattern on it. This is micarta, by far my favorite handle material, micarta. And it is great because it's very grippy, and over time it's going to patina and change. Titanium on its own is great because you can anodize it and you get a really good look. And the fact is, nothing on this is going to break because it's a solid piece of steel. And then you have G10, which is a lot like micarta. This is just black G10, which is just laminated fiberglass with resin, and it's very, very strong and it's light. So depending on what you want, these might be a little bit heavier than this because you've got raw titanium versus just a little bit of steel and some material. Carbon fiber, the lightest of all, which makes this relatively large knife still fairly light. So handle shape is determinant on what you're going to do with the knife and the size of your hands and how it feels to you. Not everyone's going to agree on handle shape because not everyone's hands are the same. Handle material is the same way. You might like the look of one material versus another, but like the feel of this better than this, which is the case. I find carbon fiber very attractive. I find micarta attractive, but I definitely am more drawn to micarta because of the way it feels versus the way it looks. So there you go. Handle shape and material. So this fifth criteria is lock mechanism. Now, lock mechanism used to be a lot more important to me than it is now, which is why it's further down the list, and this is why it's my list of what I look at in knives. And I guarantee everybody's list is going to pretty much have the same items, but they're just going to be in a different order. But this is like one of the last things I look at is lock mechanism. Now, I have knives that don't specifically lock. This is a double detent. It doesn't have a lock. This is a liner lock. I love liner locks these days because the ergos on it are great, and new liner locks these days are really strong. Button locks are another fun one because you have a lock that is a little bit different and it has a completely different feel, and it keeps you completely out of the way of the travel the blade. Frame locks have been some of my favorite locks for a long time, and they're very, very similar to liner locks. I mean, you're looking at basically the same mechanism, just a smaller version of it with a scale over it. Lock backs, back locks of all kinds of sorts are great because these are truly ambidextrous, and there's other versions of it. I brought this one out because this is technically a different version of the same kind of thing. This is a rocker lock. This is a ring lock. You basically have the same kind of mechanism at play. This is locked until you pull back on this. This is locked until you pull back on that, but you do it in a rocker fashion and push it forward. So these locks and lock mechanisms are all viable and they're great. And it just depends on what you're going to do with the knife. For somebody that's out in a field working, wearing gloves, this might be a little bit easier to try and manipulate than say this one, because this one has got not anywhere near as much to get a hold of. If you're wearing big gloves, it would probably be a little difficult to get in on this lock. This one would be great for that. Another one that would work for that would be the button lock. Button locks are great if you're in gloves. Locks like this, if you're just running around the house and you've got little tasks you're gonna do, this knife gets thrown in my pocket so much because it's light. It doesn't take up very much space. I forget it's in my pocket sometimes. And if I just need to cut something real quick, look, I got that. I've got it right here. So the lock mechanism is gonna be determined, your choice in lock mechanism is gonna be determined by what you're doing and what you want and how you want that to feel. This lock has zero of the ergo issues that you may see on any of these other locks because the lock is back here. And so when it's in hand, you feel nothing. So picking a lock mechanism is something that you really should look at. There's a lot of them out there. There's also shark locks and back locks and stuff like that, like the Atlas lock, that are all viable, good locking systems. And it's just, like I said, a lot of what you have to look at is how are you going to carry it? If I was working construction still, I would probably not carry this. It would be a lot more difficult for me to use this knife and unlock it to close it back up because I'd be wearing gloves and things like that. So there you go. That's lock mechanisms on that. And so the last two that I look at, I kind of threw it together. This is weight and blade material, which are the last two things I look at. Now, I understand a lot of guys think about, the first thing they think about is weight. This is a very light knife. This, for its size, is extremely light. This is not so light because it's a big, beefy knife. And the rest of these fall in the middle ground. This is a fairly light knife as well. So Weight for me is not an issue because I'm a big guy and I'm not hiking or backpacking. But for a lot of guys, they want to look and see, like, is there weight reduction? I'm not a backpacker or a hiker where that would be a concern of mine. I'm not going out and every ounce counts. This knife is very light. But it does not have any weight reduction. You will look in some knives and see that there's been a lot of material that has been removed from the inside of that knife, like this one, which makes this really large knife extremely light. This is one of the lightest knives on the counter, even though it's the largest of them. This knife, made in aluminum, very light, extremely light handles. This knife is probably, these are just about the same weight, to tell you the truth, which sounds funny because this is so much bigger. So weight for me, not an issue. Now, blade steel, blade material for a lot of people is a big deal. I, these days, do not care so much whether I get something that's in like 20 CV like this, which is a super steel. This is well 20 CV on this one. That is a super steel. This is S35VN, which is a steel that at one point was a super steel, but it's kind of fallen by the wayside and has been replaced by others. S90V is an incredibly good steel, but the fact is I'm every bit as happy with a knife like this in 14C28N, which is a very affordable budget steel that does every bit as good a job for the things that I do on a daily basis now as these other super steels. Now, if there are some people that need some steels that are just, they need something that's going to hold up forever and things like that. I prefer at this point something that's a little easier to sharpen than 20 CV or some of the higher end steels like S90V, S125V, which is a nightmare. I prefer something that I'm going to be able to maintain a little bit better versus something that's going to hold up forever and just be a bear to sharpen. I can sharpen this up, strop this up pretty much anywhere, and it's going to be great. The fact that this is a combination of light and a really good budget steel makes it a winner in my book. But for me, at this point in my knife collecting and the things that I do at 48 versus the things I did when I was in my 20s, I'm not looking for the end-all be-all in steel. At one point I was. Now for me, the steel is one of the last things I look at. It is actually the last thing I look at, is what the steel is. Now, I will say, I want that steel to be properly heat treated. I want a good heat treat on the steel. The S90V, and this is great. 20 CV and both of these, awesome. This especially with a custom heat treat, really good. The 14C on this is great. So I will go with a budget steel versus something higher end rather than, you know, than just try to break the bank and be on the high end steel side chasing that Rockwell. And you will notice that price was not a criteria on this because I have knives ranging from thousands of dollars to tens of dollars. I love knives. I'm not going to set price as a criteria. I mean, there are some times that price is a criteria. Price, like, am I going to buy a Benchmade? No, I think they're overpriced and things like that. But it's really not on my list of things that I look at if it's a knife I'm interested in. You know, if it's a knife I'm interested in, it's a good knife, it's probably worth what they're charging. So there you go. There's the criteria stuff I look for in knives. So let's turn this around, do some final thoughts, and send you out about your day. There you go, guys. Those are the criteria I look at for knives, not just from a consumer standpoint, but also as a reviewer. If you watch my videos, you hear me talk about pretty much all of those items and how I would weigh them and the things that I see with these knives. So not just as a consumer, but also as a reviewer, those are the criteria I look at. I do know that there was a guy out there that's like, are you being negligent? Are you just ignorant or whatever? The guy, the Canadian Cutlery, whatever, he does like $10, $15 knives. He was saying we don't ever talk about the edge or the edge geometry. I talk about it every time. If there's an issue with the edge geometry or something like that in a knife, I definitely bring it to you guys' attention. If I don't mention it, then there's probably not much wrong with it, not just from the standard of a knife reviewer, but also as a knife maker and a knife sharpener. So guys, that's it on this one. If you like the content, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like it, give it a thumbs down, but please try to tell me why. I can't change that content if you don't tell me what you don't like, if you want to support the channel. It's as simple as like, share, subscribe, drop a comment, hit the bell icon. If you do hit the bell icon, make sure you've got notifications turned on your device or you'll not get notified. Make sure you have that notification set to all. If you want to support the channel financially, however, there's a bunch of ways down below. I have a ton of affiliate links set up down below, from gear to knives to tools, on Amazon. I also have a few affiliates that will save you money at checkout. Doll Strong Knives, you save 10% at checkout by using my affiliate link. Coffee Brand Coffee, you save 5% on your order. Right now, Atlas VPN, which is the VPN I use, is offering, I think, 80% off. You can get 2 years for $44. It is actually a really good service. And then Airfare Consolidator will save you 3% on your, up to 3% or a minimum of 3%, I can't remember which it is, for domestic airfare. So other ways you can do it, I have a membership, which is tier-based. Everyone has access to my Gilded server. Baseline and premium tier members are automatically entered into a giveaway that I do on the Gilded server, and the premium guys have access to a sharpening tutorial series here on YouTube that you can only access as a paying member. The final way is I have a merchandise store at Ember Shirt Co. where you can get my merchandise, or you can pick up other creators' merchandise at a 10% discount as well with my coupon code CrazySharp. Capital C, capital S, all one word. CrazySharp saves you 10% at checkout. Guys, that's it on this one. I love you all. Keep it clean in the comment section. If it's your birthday, happy birthday. And I'll see you in the next video.